It appears in the final line be replaced with the words lease providers,
Yes.
so that the final sentence of that paragraph reads, while we see this in payday lending, small consumer credit contracts and consumer lease providers, we do not see it regularly in other areas.
Yes, that's right.
Do you have a pen that allows you to initial that amendment there, Mr. Boyle?
I do.
It's page 19, yes, you have that there? Thank you, Mr. Boyle. With that amendment, are the contents of your statement true and correct?
They are.
I tender that statement.
Exhibit 4.138, the statement of Mr. Boyle.
Now, could you please describe, firstly, Mr. Boyle, your cultural background?
Yes, I'm a Wiradjuri man. My family's from central western New South Wales, but I grew up on Biripi country my whole life, and I now live on Gadigal country in Sydney.
Thank you. And could you tell us about your professional background, Mr. Boyle?
Yes, I have completed a law degree, but I want to make it quite clear that I am not a lawyer. I've been working in Indigenous policy issues professionally since 2006 and in financial services issues for Indigenous people specifically since around 2009, and I've been in my current role at ASIC since 2011.
Now, Mr. Boyle, have you been involved in advisory groups in the course of your work?
Yes, I have.
Could you tell us about your work for those advisory groups?
Yes, as part of my professional role at ASIC, I sit on the National Indigenous Consumer Strategy Reference Group, which implements and designs the National Indigenous Consumer Strategy. I have also sat on the Indigenous Advisory Group of the National Indigenous Financial Services Network from approximately 2011 until 2015. I sit on the advisory group for the North Queensland Indigenous Consumer Issues Task Force, and outside of my role at ASIC, I also sit on the Indigenous Advisory Group of the Indigenous Financial Resilience research that's been conducted by the Centre for Social Impact and First Nations Foundation, and I'm on the Indigenous Advisory Group of the Financial Rights Legal Centre.
And are you also, Mr. Boyle, on the editorial panel of the Indigenous Law Bulletin?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Now, could you please give us a brief overview of the work of ASIC's Indigenous Outreach Program?
Yes, ASIC's Indigenous Outreach Program is a team of lawyers and analysts with specialist skills working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. We've had a formal program at ASIC called the Indigenous Outreach Program since about 2009, and our team performs a range of functions. The first is to provide financial capability education to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander consumers. We do that predominantly through resources that are placed on the Money Smart website, as well as through face-to-face interactions and a range of other innovative types of financial capability devices that we design to try and assist Indigenous people to understand financial services. Our second role is working with the financial services industry to try and show them where policies and procedures that they have might not be adequately servicing Indigenous financial consumers, and to really take them out and show them how them policies work on the ground to try and increase financial inclusion of Indigenous people. And then we also take reports of misconduct from Indigenous consumers and their advocates about their interactions with financial services, and we will assist ASIC's other teams to conduct investigations and enforcement activities in a culturally appropriate way, and assist ASIC to engage with Indigenous witnesses on the ground so that they can provide their evidence comfortably.
How does ASIC decide where to conduct its Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander outreach work?
As with all agencies, I think we do have limited resources, and we'd love to do our outreach work everywhere. But we try and pick areas where we think we're going to have the greatest impact. So where we think that a particular community has a serious issue accessing a particular financial service, we might engage with that community and take industry leaders there to show them what the issues are. We'll also get requests to travel to communities about particular issues from consumer advocates or Indigenous consumers themselves. Or from time to time, we'll be asked by other government agencies to conduct outreach for particular purposes. And an example of that is the fee-free ATM initiative, where our team provided some education to communities that didn't have other money management workers in them.
Can you explain what ASIC's Indigenous helpline is?
Yes, ASIC runs both a telephone and email helpline, and that provides direct access to myself and other members of my team. So consumer advocates and Indigenous consumers can contact that helpline anytime that they have an issue that they think we might be able to assist with. But as part of the National Indigenous Consumer Strategy, we also have a no wrong door policy. So any Indigenous consumer or their advocate can ring us about any problem, and we'll try and direct them to the appropriate service if it's not us.
And how many calls do you tend to receive on that line each year?
Each year, we would receive in excess of 500 calls, I would estimate.
And could you just finally tell us a little bit more about your specific role within the Indigenous Outreach Program?
Yes, I'm a senior policy analyst, and I've been in the team since 2011, as I said before. The team has only been around since 2009, so really shortly after ASIC started a particular focus on assisting Indigenous consumers, I've been involved in the team. I'm involved in all aspects of the work of the team, so I help to produce or advise on financial capability materials, assist in taking evidence and preparing witnesses for court, and also in leading industry tours, I guess, for want of a better term, to Indigenous communities to try and highlight the barriers.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. I'll come back to ask you some further questions, but could I turn to you now, Mrs. Edwards? Your name is Lynda Edwards.
Yes, that's correct.
And you are the Coordinator Financial Capability at Financial Counselling Australia.
Yes.
And Financial Counselling Australia's head office is at 179 Queen Street in Melbourne.
Correct.
Now, Mrs. Edwards, have you been issued with a summons to attend the hearing today?
I have.
Do you have that summons with you?
I do.
I tender that summons.
Exhibit 4.139, the summons to Mrs. Edwards.
And Mrs. Edwards, have you made a statement to the Commission dated the 22nd of June 2018?
I have.
And is there an amendment that you wish to make to paragraph 57 of your
Yes.
statement? And is that amendment to the fourth line in that paragraph?
Yes.
And is the amendment to amend the word changed to read charged?
Correct.
So that sentence now reads, this was because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were charged each time they checked their account balance or withdrew cash.
Correct.
Have you made that amendment to the statement, Mrs.
Yes.
Edwards? Have you initialled that?
No.
Thank you. If you could initial that. And with that amendment, are the contents of your statement true and correct?
Yes.
I tender the statement, Commissioner.
Exhibit 4.140 is the statement of Mrs. Edwards.
Mrs. Edwards, could I ask you to please describe your cultural background?
Yes. I'm a Wankamara woman from New South Wales, central New South Wales, far west New South Wales. I live now on Wiradjuri country in central New South Wales. I'd like to take this opportunity now to let you know that I am off country, and I would like to acknowledge the Larrakia Nation and pay my respects to the people of the Larrakia Nation. Yes, and so Narromine is about approximately 430 kilometres from Sydney.
Thank you. That's where you reside?
Yes, it is.
Yes. Now, could you also tell us about your professional background, Mrs. Edwards?
So I had 11 years working with local government as a finance officer, and 13 years working with Catholic Care in Wilcannia Falls in central New South Wales. I was employed as a program manager and worked predominantly with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in a financial counselling capability role. I am an accredited financial counsellor with Financial Counselling New South Wales, and am currently studying the Diploma of Financial Counselling.
Thank you. And are there government or community sector bodies in which you have participated over the years?
Yes, I have been a representative on a number of government and community sector bodies. These include the Commonwealth Consumer Affairs Advisory Council, which is an advisory body to federal government, the Indigenous Financial Services Network that's working with the banking industry, and I have also assisted Financial Counselling Australia on a voluntary basis to coordinate the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Forum, which is an annual one-day event for financial counsellors and capability workers. I also sit on the Indigenous Resilience Research Project with First Nations Foundation and the Centre for Social Impact. I am a member of the Telstra Indigenous Advisory Body, and I partner with First Nations Foundation on shared practices and program and activities that are specifically designed by and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Thank you, Mrs. Edwards. And could you please give the Commission a brief overview of the work that Financial Counselling Australia does?
Yes, Financial Counselling Australia is the peak body for financial counsellors in Australia. Financial counsellors provide advice and support to people that are in financial hardship. They work predominantly in community organisations and their services are free. They give advice, independent, confidential advice, and funding for financial counselling services are mainly provided by federal and state government. Financial Counselling Australia was formed in 1984 and it is a federated body. There are 7 members of financial counselling, which are the state and territories. Individual financial counsellors are then members of their respective state and territory associations. Financial Counselling Australia's role is to coordinate and support financial counsellors in their profession and to advocate for a fairer marketplace. This includes sharing information, providing professional development and training, developing resources for financial counsellors, writing submissions in response to policy proposals, and participating in relevant consultation groups around Indigenous financial literacy.
And Mrs. Edwards, what's the difference between a financial counsellor and a financial capability worker?
Financial Counselling Australia's current contract with the federal government is to support financial capability workers. Financial capability workers are the ones that participate and run educational workshops around financial literacy to people on the ground. At the moment, there are approximately 70 financial capability workers across Australia, and approximately 40 of those work predominantly in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Yes.
And how many financial counsellors work with Financial Counselling Australia?
There's approximately 780 financial counsellors across Australia, and 10% of those work predominantly with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. And there are just over 50 financial counsellors that identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander.
Thank you, Mrs. Edwards. Now, could I move to asking both of you some questions? Can I start, Mrs. Edwards, with you by asking you about the obstacles that are faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who live in regional and remote communities when engaging with financial services entities?
Yes, there are a number of barriers that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in remote and regional communities come into contact, and that's certainly one of those is about access. So many communities are long distances from branches, and an example of that is the community of Midajulu at the base of Uluru is 470 kilometres from the nearest branch. And so many people living in remote communities find it very difficult to access any bank branches due to obviously long distances, but also to the environment. So many people have to travel across, dirt roads. So when the rains come, roads are cut for months at a time. Language and literacy are a major problem for regional and remote, particularly remote communities, where English is, can sometimes be second, third, or even a fourth language. So understanding, what banking products are, and particularly the products where it's written is always really difficult for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There's very limited understanding of banking products. So there's not that understanding of what actually is an interest rate and what does it actually mean. And certainly the total, cost of a loan is something that, that a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in those communities do not understand. We have culture and kinship within our communities, and the understanding that one person can be responsible for another and the environment that they live in. So having kinship, which is a type of cultural obligation, will actually play a role in people's financial affairs. And unfortunately, most of the financial services don't understand cultural obligation when it comes to hardship policies. The other barriers that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is that there's a trust. So it's really inappropriate to disagree or not talk to someone. And we found that with door-to-door sales, where there's not that opportunity for people to say go away. They will sit and they will stand and listen to the person, and obviously then sign a contract. We have really low incomes within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander regional and remote communities. We know that the majority of people in those communities are on Centrelink benefits, and trying to purchase food in remote communities can be really difficult as well. So the cost of groceries within those regional and remote communities could be 2 or 3 times the amount that people would pay in urban centres.
Now, Mr Boyle, on my count, Mrs Edwards has raised 7 different obstacles there. Can I take you to each of those and ask you if you'd like to comment on any of them? The first was access to financial services, particularly geographical access to financial services. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, but first I would just like to say that and kind of commenting on your opening statement yesterday, that there is as much diversity amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in terms of financial knowledge and capability as there is in the broader population. And in the work that my team does at ASIC, we tend to come across people who have much lower levels of financial literacy and are at the edge and being excluded financially. But certainly the comments that I make today, I don't want them to be taken as applying to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living in remote areas. So the first was the geographical isolation.
Yes.
And yes, we see a lot of barriers that come from geographical isolation. People being significant distances from bank branches does mean that it's difficult for them to get a face-to-face service. And that is compounded by identification issues for Indigenous people, and I know we'll talk about that as another issue. But if an Indigenous person in a remote community wants to access a financial service and they don't have appropriate identification documentation, then at the moment often they're being asked to travel to the nearest bank branch, and as Ms Edwards said, or as Lynda said, that can be 480, 500 kilometres away. And that request is often made for people if they lose a key card, for example, and they contact their bank branch and they're unable to pass the authentication process over the telephone, then they're asked to go to their local bank branch. So that geographical isolation really does present a major barrier. Also, in a lot of particularly remote and very remote Indigenous communities, information and communication technology is only relatively recently implemented into the communities. And as an example, I was in the Ungalak'in lands in northwest South Australia 4 weeks ago, and mobile telephone networks were only turned on in that community 6 weeks ago. So there are still communities in Australia that don't have reliable internet or telephone coverage, and that makes it very difficult for people to contact their bank branches as well.
Now, the second set of obstacles that Mrs Edwards referred to, I understood to relate to both language and literacy. Do you wish to comment on those?
Yes, there is a small but significant proportion of Indigenous people that still don't have very good English literacy skills. So there are people who struggle to read or understand financial concepts, and there are people that do struggle to communicate over the telephone with financial service providers. So that is a significant issue. Educational levels in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, particularly regional and remote areas, tend to be much lower than for the general population. And that means that they are unable to comprehend and to understand the complex language that's used in many financial agreements or by financial service providers.
Now, Mrs. Edwards also referred to a lack of understanding of how financial products work. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. I would second what Lynda said in regards to that. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have a relatively recent, particularly in rural, regional and remote areas, have a relatively recent experience at working with financial services. So for a lot of people, they were subject to income management policies and haven't had access or the ability to make their own decisions about finances. So there is a real lack of understanding about the way that financial products do work. And Lynda gave the example of people not understanding interest rates, and we certainly come across that. In one of the matters that ASIC ran, people were being charged 48% interest under a contract, and as part of our investigation of the misconduct, we asked people what their understanding of that interest rate was. Was 48% good, or was that a bad interest rate? A lot of people told us that it was very good, and people told us that the higher the interest rate was, the better it was. So people, I think out of about 20 people that we spoke to, only 2 people could tell us that interest was actually money that you paid on top or extra for. So if people can't understand interest rates, then that means that they have real difficulties understanding a whole range of other financial products and services. Another example would be overdrafts or informal overdrafts on banking accounts where people have a debit card and go to an ATM. For a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, if money comes out of their bank account, they think that they did have money in their bank account. So we see a lot of people being charged quite significant fees where they've had a direct debit dishonour or where their account's gone into overdraft and they really weren't aware that overdrafts existed or that there were fees attached to that.
Mrs. Edwards also referred to Aboriginal culture and kinship structures. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
I can, and I don't propose to be an expert on anyone's kinship structures other than my own families and my own communities. But we do have relatively complex kinship structures, and so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people don't view our family as being a nuclear family, as Western communities tend to. We'll have obligations to a range of other people in our communities and in broader, not even necessarily blood relations, that are also seen by us as being the most appropriate person or the closest family contact for financial services issues. And we see that playing a particularly disadvantageous role in the administration of deceased estates around superannuation, because under the trust documents and the way that superannuation estates are passed out, it does tend to have a focus on the nuclear family, and for a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, that will not be the appropriate person to receive the estate. So we do see families that will have a deceased estate, and there will be conversations made, but because the appropriate person to receive the benefit under that estate is not a family member that is allowed to receive that payment, we see people not even make an application.
Now, I want to come back to you to talk about the other factors that Mrs. Edwards raised, but while we're talking about culture and kinship structures, can I ask you, Mrs. Edwards, in your work, what does it mean to have the sorts of obligations, excuse me, that both of you have discussed in a practical sense in an Aboriginal community?
A typical example is for funerals, when people are attending funerals. So what would normally happen is families would travel to the community where the funeral's been held, and the hosting family where they would stay would be responsible for feeding the family. So that could possibly mean that there are 20 more people that live in the home, that stay in the home for the length of time. And in some remote communities, the grieving process, because all of the community grieve together, could be weeks, rather than just days in a traditional Western society. So, you know, the electricity goes up because there's extra people in the house. One of the things is that, you know, because family members need to be there, it's culturally appropriate for family members to be there, that sometimes they can't get there. So then that sharing of resources, ensuring that, you know, petrol is paid for people to be able to drive to and from the funeral is one of those examples.
Thank you.
Just touching on what Lynda said around funeral arrangements as well, that is another area where our kinship structures do play a significant role. So funeral insurance products, for example, they often have particular beneficiaries who can make the claims, whereas in remote Aboriginal communities in particular, there can be a certain member of the community that's responsible for making arrangements for funerals, and they're not necessarily the people who have the ability to make claims under funeral insurance policies. So we do see that sometimes having a negative effect as well.
Now, returning to the obstacles identified by Mrs. Edwards, another obstacle that Mrs. Edwards identified related to the trust that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can place in others. You refer in your statement to the concept of gratuitous concurrence. Are you able to explain what that means?
Yes, gratuitous concurrence is a tendency for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to agree to a proposition that's put to them, or to make affirmative noises in response to a proposition that's put to them, regardless of whether or not they agree with that proposition. So that's the first way that gratuitous concurrence plays out. And the second way is where an Indigenous person will answer yes to a question that they don't understand, rather than want to appear silly. And so there is a tendency among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people not to want to appear rude to a financial service provider, for example, and they will agree yes, even without understanding what they're being asked.
The final matters that Mrs. Edwards referred to related to low income and the high cost of living in remote communities. Would you like to comment on either of those matters?
I'll comment briefly, which is that, and again, we see unemployment and the types of employment programs that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly in remote areas, have playing out in the superannuation sector again. So a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in remote communities are part of employment programs run by the government, like the Community Development Employment Program, for example, which requires people to undertake work-like activities for up to 25 hours a week. And we see a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that don't see the difference between them kind of government employment programs and paid employment. So that creates difficulties for people in understanding whether or not their family members might have had superannuation, or whether they themselves will have superannuation. Just with that gratuitous concurrence aspect, I'd like to go back to that just briefly, because I think it's quite a difficult concept to understand. But in a recent outcome that we had with Clearview Life Assurance Limited, we listened to a range of call recordings as part of investigating some misconduct that was reported to us. And what we heard in some of those calls was people who were being walked through the process of signing up to a funeral or life insurance policy. And they were saying yes or and in a couple of the calls, we've seen consumers that said, the telephone representative would ask them, can you provide us with your bank details? And they say, oh, I don't want to pay anything. Oh no, you won't have to pay anything now, just provide us with your bank details. Yes, okay. And they provided the details and ended up being signed up to policies that they never intended to sign up for. So that's the way that gratuitous concurrence can play out in practice, that people will provide details that they're asked for by someone that they see in a position of authority over the telephone, including bank details and other personal information, to the point they've provided enough information to have entered into a contract even though they never intended to.
Now, is there anything else that either of you would like to say generally about obstacles encountered by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in remote communities in their dealings with financial services entities?
No, not at this time, no.
The only other real barrier for people that I see, I'm sure that there are others that I've missed, is in enforcing their rights in financial services. So the way that we enforce our rights in Australia is through the court systems, and we have an adversarial type system where people are represented, and Often when we're investigating financial services misconduct or allegations of poor behaviour in Indigenous communities, people want to present their evidence as one story, and it is quite difficult for them to then enforce their rights in a court in the way that we usually would in Australia.
Now, I want to move on to particular products and the way Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people engage with those products. But before I do that, could I return to something that you said earlier, Mr. Boyle, which was about difficulties experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in meeting the identity requirements in dealing with banks in particular. Could you tell us some more about that?
Yes, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been subject to a lot of government policies historically, including policies around the removal of children. So a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in regional and remote communities don't register births, deaths or marriages. And that means that they don't have a birth certificate, for example. And without a birth certificate, it can be quite difficult to access other types of identification documentation, such as a driver's licence or Centrelink. The other issue with identification is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, again, particularly in remote and regional areas, tend to have a range of names. They might have their traditional or skin name, they might have a birth name, they might have an adoptive name, and it's not uncommon to see people having identification documents in all three of those names. And I can give you one brief example to illustrate that issue. Which was, I was in Lockhart River, I think it was back in 2013, doing some work on superannuation, and a gentleman came to me and he was 72 years of age, and I believe at the time the life expectancy there was 58 years for men. He had superannuation and he said to me, when will this money come to me? We told him that he'd reached his condition of release and there was financial counsellors there to provide some assistance. When we asked for his identification documents, we asked, did he have a birth certificate? And he said yes. The government had come to the community and helped people to access birth certificates a couple of years ago. And his name was Normie, N-O-R-M-I-E. So his birth certificate was in that name, and obviously with his surname as well. But often when government departments issue birth certificates after someone's been born or a significant period of time later, they'll register the birth as either the 1st of January or the 1st of July in the year that the person believes that they were born, and that was the case for Normie. In a lot of remote communities, people don't have access to the range of services that we do in cities or in urban centres. So to get a driver's licence in a remote community, often you go to the police station, and that was the case with Normie. He'd gone to the police station and he remembered his real date of birth, for example, was 23rd of March. He told the police officer that and been handed his driver's licence, and the driver's licence said that his first name was Norman. He said to the police officer, that's not my name, my name's Normie. And the police officer told him, no, Normie's not a real name, your name's Norman. So he had two formal identification documents that both had different names and different dates of birth. And we see that play out in a whole, often.
So you mentioned the superannuation context there. The superannuation context and the bank context are the two contexts in which those difficulties arise, is that right?
That's where we see it most often.
Yes. And in the banking context, how do identification issues emerge?
Identification issues emerge really at two key points in the banking system. So the first is at establishing a bank account. If you don't have adequate identification documentation, it can be almost impossible to even open a standard bank account, which means that a proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are completely financially excluded and don't have access to even basic financial products. The second place that we see identification play a role, and I think I mentioned it briefly earlier, was where someone might lose a debit card, for example, or lose a banking product and need to have a new card issued. And they'll contact their bank via the telephone, and it can be quite difficult for people to identify themselves or to answer the questions that are asked over the telephone. Sometimes we see financial services have policies about the types of questions that are asked, and they can only ask questions in a certain way which might not make sense to an Aboriginal person in a remote community. So, for example, one that we come across quite regularly is where we'll be assisting someone to contact a financial services entity, and they'll be asked, what is your street address? And in a lot of remote communities, there aren't street names, and the person will say, oh, I don't have a street address. or they'll be asked 3 or 4 times what the street address is, whereas if they were asked what number is on the front of your house, then they can answer that question. But sometimes the language means that people aren't able to meet the identification requirements. And as I said earlier, that often results, and it has in the past resulted, we've had specific examples of it, of people failing that identification process and then being told to travel to their nearest bank branch. And Lockhart River is a community I'll come back to again in that circumstance. So the closest bank branch to Lockhart River is in Cairns, and I had a call a couple of years ago from a lady who had lost her bank card, had failed the identification processes, and was then told to travel to Cairns to visit her local bank branch. And it was during the wet season, so the only way that she could get to Cairns was to fly from Lockhart River, which was quite expensive, and she was quite distressed when she contacted us.
Mrs. Edwards, would you like to comment on identification issues for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in their dealings with banks or with superannuation funds?
Yeah, so for financial counsellors, we realise that verifying identification for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is really challenging. Sometimes we know that documents are actually not kept by the person. It's usually sometimes kept by either the mother or the matriarch or the grandmother within the families. Many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in remote communities can be transient, so they may not even be in a place where their birth certificate is. In 2016, AUSTRAC released...
I'm sorry, if you could just repeat that, Mrs.
Sorry,
Edwards.
in 2016, AUSTRAC released new guidance about the requirements for identification for financial entities, and that's where those entities, instead of getting birth certificates, could actually get people to identify by going to a community, a local Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander community service or a local elder. Unfortunately, those processes are not always kept and used by financial entities, and we know that for financial counsellors in particular, the time to assist people in proving their identities can be a real challenge and takes a long time.
What proportion of financial counsellors' time in dealing with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients do you think is made up of dealing with identification problems, assisting with identification problems?
I would say probably for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, more time than is actually required. And it seems that every financial counsellor that is actually working with, most financial counsellors that are working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander are saying that majority of a day would be taken trying to help a person prove their identity.
Mr. Boyle, what have you observed about the uptake of the AUSTRAC guidance about alternative ways of satisfying identification requirements?
Yeah, so that AUSTRAC guidance that allows people to provide alternative documentation when they can't meet the standard 100 points of identification has been acknowledged and taken up by financial services institutions at the kind of head office level. Yeah. But what we've seen is that often the existence of that alternative guidance or alternative ways for Indigenous people to identify themselves to financial service providers hasn't filtered down to the customer-facing staff or to the telephone staff. So whilst the guidance is there and we see commitment to implementing the alternative guidance by the financial services industry, we're still not seeing a real reduction in the difficulties that people are having identifying themselves on the ground. It often takes people to elevate that to someone like myself at ASIC in order for that to be highlighted to a financial institution that there are alternative policies in existence. So yeah, and we receive regular reports from people who are aware of the guidance, consumer advocates who will contact our assistance line and will say, look, I've still been having difficulties with my clients and they're still being told to go to local bank branches or they're not being assisted to get into that additional process. So I think that the policies are there and they're known by the institutions and the institutions have a commitment to applying them, but that hasn't necessarily reached the customer-facing staff, which means the difficulties still exist.
Any observations about that, Mrs.
Yeah,
Edwards?
and that certainly has been reported by financial counsellors where, they are actually talking to financial services staff at the coalface where they're saying, well, have you seen their AUSTRAC guidance? And they would say, what is that? So then taking them through that process and then them realising that there are other alternatives to identification.
What do you observe about the numbers of employees of financial services entities who are Indigenous people?
Just personally myself, so I have actually met and I actually know some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that have actually worked in the banking industry that have left because they were pressured to sell products to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that they knew themselves were not appropriate.
Do you think it would be valuable for Indigenous people to be employed by financial services entities to assist in engagement with Indigenous people?
I think, most financial services and particularly the banks with reconciliation action plans, as long as they're ones that are actually going to be, that they're, competent in working within that document and listening to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff that, say what their challenges are. I think that, it would be, very beneficial to have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within branches because I know myself, if I go into a branch and I see an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person there, that's the person that I want to know that I would like to deal with.
Mr. Boyle, do you have any views about that?
I certainly think that more employment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the financial services industry would assist institutions to understand the issues and would certainly make it easier for Indigenous people, particularly those in regional and remote areas, to access them services. Just having a voice that understands a person's needs or the difficulties that they're facing can make them feel much more comfortable, and it can also make people more open and less likely to fall into practices like gratuitous concurrence. If they're dealing with another Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person, they can form a bit of a relationship and often feel more comfortable asking questions and asserting their rights. So certainly I would support more employment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the financial services sector.
Can I turn now to asking you some questions about the particular financial products that are used by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in these communities and their understanding of those products? Can I start with you, Mr. Boyle, and could I ask you to explain how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in remote and regional communities use debit cards?
Yes, certainly. I mentioned briefly earlier that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people use debit cards, but I guess to explain debit cards, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people might have a debit card or a credit card or cards with overdrafts, and often we find that people in remote and regional areas don't understand the differences between the various types of cards. So that's the first thing. But ATM fees have been a significant issue in particularly remote Indigenous communities. And there was an ATM task force quite a number of years ago that wanted to investigate the impact that ATM fees were having on remote Indigenous people's finances, because consumer advocates had been reporting that a significant proportion of people's income was being taken by ATM fees. And ASIC was part of that task force with the Reserve Bank and Treasury, as I understand it. But what people observed was that the ATM fees that were being charged in those communities, they were comparative to urban areas, so they weren't a great deal higher. But what the issue was and why people were spending so much on ATM fees was that real lack of understanding about how debit cards work. And so the behaviour that was observed was that someone would go and put their card into an ATM machine in the morning and find out that they didn't have any money in there yet and they would be charged a fee. They might do that 2 or 3 times and then the money would be in their account. They would withdraw, say, $20 from their account, and then they would put their card in again to check what the remaining balance was. So people were sometimes paying 5 or 6 bank fees in order just to withdraw $20. And again, the withdrawal of small amounts of money by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in remote areas is often a way for them to manage their money. So they'll withdraw a small amount of cash, what they need for that day, and that way that they are able to budget that over the fortnight. But that means that making them regular small withdrawals is costing them a fee each time.
Can I ask you a question about another concept that you refer to in your statement that I think might be relevant to the answer you've just given, and that's the concept of humbug. Could you explain what humbug is?
Yes, so demand sharing, for want of a better term, is something that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures have had for many thousands of years, in that we have obligations, reciprocal obligations, to care for each other and to provide support, both emotional and in terms of kind of material objects or food. That's extended now into the financial services space, where often there is an obligation to assist other family members with money, but where repeated demands are made for money and it becomes almost a bit of a hassle, that particular family members are often requesting money, sometimes from more vulnerable people, then that's coined humbug, where someone is being repeatedly requested to provide money for family members, and it sometimes leaves them with not enough money for themselves. And so that's why I said sometimes that people do withdraw them smaller amounts of money, so they know that if they've only got $20 with them, then that is probably all they'll be humbugged for that day.
And are debit cards shared by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in these communities?
Yes, often a debit card will be shared, and other people will have access to both the debit card and the PIN number. That's both just as a result of general demand sharing obligations, but also as a result of other services, informal credit services, for example, in Indigenous communities, Book Up, for example, where some providers will require Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to leave their debit card and their PIN number and details of their income at a store to access that service. So the person might be without access to their own banking products for some time, and then they'll utilise other family members' products to do that. I just wanted to make one more comment about the debit cards as well, which is, while some people withdraw quite small amounts of money, $20 at a time, sometimes people do need to withdraw larger amounts of money. And on ATMs that are located in very remote communities, often there are withdrawal limits of, say, $200, which means that in order to access $1,000, you need to pay 5 bank fees because you need to withdraw 5 lots of $200.
Mrs. Edwards, a number of themes have come up in Mr. Boyle's answer about the use and understanding of debit cards in these communities. Can I ask you to comment on those themes, including humbugging?
Yep, certainly. So we know that through the financial counsellors that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in their communities are sharing debit cards and PINs, and there are other reasons of that is if it's an elderly person, they don't always remember their PIN, so it's usually the younger people that would actually hold that card, or family member, that then sort of leaves people open to economic abuse, but in most cases people do share and do that because of cultural obligation. So when we're thinking about kinship and cultural obligations, we need to think that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, sharing and looking after each other and looking after the environment has been for over 40,000 years. Money's only really been in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander society for just on 3 generations. So it's a really early experience for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and for people in remote communities, it's probably even less than that. And so it is really challenging. So, if you're responsible for someone, emotionally, socially, you're also responsible for them economically too. So it's really difficult to be able to say to a family member, I can't help you, because I know that with majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, that's really playing with our spirit, and it's not in the spirit of giving. So certainly it is a real challenge for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So in regards to the debit cards, we know, and Financial Counselling Australia was one of those services that went on the road in regards to that task force for ATMs. And we are seeing, and we have seen at that time the multiple use of debit cards when accessing the ATMs, and and that's because the payments that Centrelink would give. So it doesn't actually mean that it's going to be there at 7 o'clock in the morning. It could be at any time during the day. It could be in the afternoon. So people are continually checking to see if their payments are there, and sometimes we can see fees for a day of being $12.50. Anything up to $16 for people to be able to just check to see if their payments are in there, and not really understanding that every time they put their card in that there's a fee around that. So
Particularly where people have a lack of English language skills. If people are unable to read in English, then often the warning that comes up on an ATM doesn't mean anything to them, and they don't realise they're being charged a fee. So one of the things that ASIC did was a number of years ago, we partnered with the Territory Insurance Office to produce talking ATM posters in a range of Indigenous languages, so that when people go to use the ATM, it talks to them in their language and says, by the way, you'll be charged a fee, and here's some tricks to avoid being charged multiple fees. So that's a real issue, that people making their multiple transactions aren't making them with the knowledge that they are being charged a fee each time.
Now, you both referred to the work of the task force that led to the ATM fee-free initiative. Mr. Boyle, can you explain what that initiative involves?
Yes, so the fee-free ATM initiative was helped to be put together by the Australian Bankers Association, and a range of financial service providers, banks and credit unions have joined into the fee-free ATM initiative. And basically, in a range of very remote Indigenous communities, as defined by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, a range of financial service providers have come together and made an agreement to make those ATM fees free for people, ATM transactions free. In very remote Indigenous communities, usually an ATM is privately owned as opposed to being owned by a branded institution, which means that they will charge fees. So the way that it works is that at the moment they're under the first authorisation, which has recently been extended. Under the first authorisation, there was 84 ATMs in very remote Indigenous communities that met the criteria of being a part of the fee-free initiative. There's a range of criteria that an ATM must meet to be able to participate in that program. So it must be in a very remote Indigenous community. It must not be located at a venue that sells alcohol or other gambling products, and a range of other factors. The latest authorisation doesn't provide a limit on the maximum amount of ATMs that can be part of that fee-free ATM initiative, but as I understand it, there still is around 84.
Around 84 ATMs?
Yes.
And are you able to say how many communities those 84 ATMs serve?
Lynda and I were having a discussion about this just this morning.
I could probably answer that. So at the moment, there's 82 ATMs that have been approved by the ACCC, and in that there are approximately 70 communities that are participating in that. So some of those communities have multiple ATMs. One of the things that would be beneficial for people in those communities is that if there's a sign on there saying that this is a fee-free ATM would be really helpful, so that if they go to one, they know that if that sign's not there, then they should go to another to be able to use it.
And in your view, Mrs. Edwards, has this been an effective initiative?
We have seen that there has been considerable savings for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people by using these ATMs, yes.
Do you have any observations about the effectiveness of the initiative, Mr. Boyle?
It's significantly reduced the detriment that's being caused by ATM fees in the communities where there are fee-free ATMs. However, the rollout of the program hasn't always been effective. So when we were providing education in a range of those communities back, I believe, in 2013, in a number of the communities we visited, there wasn't any cash in the fee-free ATM, so people were still needing to use ATMs that were charging them with fees. And I had a recent report, I think it was 3 weeks ago, from the Commonwealth Bank, and they have a job title called a customer advocate that travels out to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to find out about their experience with the bank. And the Commonwealth Bank rang me to say that their customer advocate had recently been on Palm Island, where there is a fee-free ATM, and that the customer advocate had noticed that Commonwealth Bank customers were still being charged ATM fees by the ATM deployer. And so as I understand, the Commonwealth Bank is currently trying to think about how to refund those fees to those customers. But so where the fee-free ATMs are working and they regularly have cash and they are not charging fees, then it has significantly reduced the impact of those fees, but it's not a perfect system. And because of the criteria that have been set up for the program, there are other communities that certainly could benefit from having a fee-free ATM, in particular where there is no other branded ATM that they could use so that they could always have fee-free transactions.
Mrs. Edwards, have you observed communities that would benefit from these fee-free ATMs but don't meet the criteria for the fee-free ATMs?
Yes, we have. So what was required at the beginning of the discussion was for people to nominate a community. And I know that within my own community, I come from Wilcannia in far west New South Wales. I nominated my community, but unfortunately the only ATM in the community was at the local club, so it wasn't eligible for a free ATM. And Wilcannia sits 200 k's from Broken Hill one side and about 260 k's from Cobar the other side, and it's actually listed as one of the most 10 disadvantaged communities in Australia.
And that community is not eligible for a
No,
fee-free
it's not.
ATM?
No.
Mr. Boyle, do you wish to say anything more about that?
The only other thing that I would say is that, and not commenting necessarily on the criteria, but as a result of that, sometimes the fee-free ATM in the community is in an area that people don't visit very regularly. So there are some communities that have a fee-free ATM, but we still see the majority of transactions happening at an ATM that charges fees. That again is often as a result of people not realising that one ATM is fee-free or not understanding they're being charged a fee either, but also that the ATM that community members prefer to go to because it is at the local shop or it's at the place where they drive into a community isn't part of that trial as a result of the criteria.
Is it common in your experience, Mrs. Edwards, for debit cards to be lost by people in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities?
Yeah, one of the challenges for people in remote communities that we've seen as financial counsellors is not being able to keep documentation very well. So, there's not a lot of people that actually have a wallet to be able to put their cards in or their birth certificate. So it's always been a real challenge that these cards are lost, and then the process of actually trying to approve identification and getting another debit card for clients has taken a lot of time for financial counsellors.
Now, finally, in relation to debit cards and transaction accounts, can I ask you, Mr. Boyle, about informal overdrafts that can be attached to these accounts? In your experience, do Aboriginal people understand when they have an informal overdraft attached to these accounts?
No, people tend not to understand what an informal overdraft is. If they use their ATM card to withdraw money and the money comes out, then people tend to think that they did have money in their account, which is where people are getting caught out with sometimes being charged overdrawn fees or interest rates on the overdrawn amount when they just simply weren't even aware that that was a possibility for them to be charged.
And is that something that you see as well, Mrs. Edwards?
Yes, definitely, yes.
Can I turn to credit cards? Mrs. Edwards, are credit cards commonly used by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in remote and regional communities?
In the experience of financial counsellors with the clients that they are seeing, there are not many people that have credit cards, and that's simply because people do not understand what a credit card is. For those people that may have it, there are very few, particularly that are seeing financial counsellors, they see credit cards as free cash, not something that they actually have to pay back. And they certainly don't understand the interest rate of a card and how long it would actually take to pay back, to be able to pay back to the credit card, over many years if they're just paying the minimum amount for that credit card.
Could I ask that we bring up on the screen a document that you've provided us, Mrs. Edwards, which is RCD 99990530001. This is a colour version of a document that you've annexed to your statement, Mrs. Edwards, which is a photograph. Now, is this a photograph of visual tools that Financial Counselling Australia uses to demonstrate the differences between a debit card and a credit card?
So Financial Counselling Australia doesn't actually use this resource. So this resource was made by a financial counsellor and a capability worker here in the Northern Territory, and they realised that for many of their clients, visual is the way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people learn the most, and because writing. Having writing, particularly for people that have English as a second, third, or even fourth language, there was just no possibility for people to actually understand what debit and credit cards were doing. So this visual, and I'll quote the workers, so the workers that actually sent me this photo. Our people are very visual, respond to the language of art through paintings on canvas or in the sand. The use of visual versus literacy is used to start the conversations with client, that we see being English as being fifth or sixth on the list of languages that can be communicated. Art is a universal language. So the painting on the right is the debit system versus credit system, so yours and theirs, banks. The drawings provoke and encourage the discussion and demonstrates that when a client uses a debit card and non-revolving credit facilities, they are in a happy place within themselves. The lower section depicts the negative emotions felt by creating debt by having contracts and credit cards in a general way of owing money. And the painting on the left depicts how banks and debt collectors are connected, and why the client gets letters demanding payment, for example, car loans and phone accounts. The drawings demonstrate that conversation between the banks and the credit reporting agencies being negative or positive. This was initiated due to clients getting letters demanding payments from Go cards and have little or no understanding of what happens after they get the goods, and then getting statements from credit providers. So basic cards and credit cards indistinguishable from each other because both are green. So green is the card for basic card and green is also for the Go card. So this story then actually begins the conversation for the financial counsellor or the capability worker to have a conversation around financial literacy.
Thank you, Mrs. Edwards. Could I attend to that colour depiction of the annexure to Mrs. Edwards' statement, Commissioner?
I call it banking visual aids.
It's described in the statement as visual tool used by financial capability workers in Alice Springs.
Visual tool used by financial capability workers, RCD 9999053053 Exhibit 4.141.
Mr. Boyle, could I ask you to comment on the use and understanding of credit cards by people in these communities?
Yes, I would agree with Lynda that credit cards, we see less people having credit cards than debit cards, and we do hear of less issues with credit cards in very remote Indigenous communities. Certainly there are pockets there are certain communities where we see a larger number of people that have got a credit card. And when people do have a credit card, they usually don't understand how it works in detail or how the interest rate works. And one example that I can think of was, again, a lady in quite a remote community. She had a credit card of $2,000 and she thought that was her $2,000 bank account. And so she would pay her entire income onto that card each fortnight. But she didn't realise why she had less and less money to spend on food each fortnight until we'd visited the community and explained it to her. So we see it. We see less people being impacted by credit cards in remote communities, but where people do have a credit card, we see people not understanding them and sometimes being called out by that misunderstanding of how the product works.
Mrs. Edwards, could I ask you to explain the concept of a basic bank account?
Yes, so through the Australian Banking Association, banks are required to have a concession account for people that are on Centrelink benefits, and also on so that where there's no fees attached to that account. And this is actually will be assisting people financially by not having fees and charges debited from their account for the amount of time that that they're using their debit cards, and this is really important when we think about how many times people go and check if their income's in the bank, or if they're withdrawing small amounts of cash, which they use as a budgeting tool. So, all of banks, all of banks are required to have concession accounts.
Now, are you familiar, Mrs. Edwards, with the draft revised banking code of practice that is currently with ASIC for approval?
A little bit, I am.
Yes. Could I show you RCD 999900370502? You see there the obligations that are proposed in the new banking code of practice in relation to basic accounts, which involve raising awareness of those accounts.
Yes.
Giving information that is easily accessible about those accounts.
Yes.
Offering those accounts if someone asks for one and they are determined to be eligible for one.
Yes.
And training staff to help them to recognise a customer or potential customer that may qualify for one of those accounts.
Yes.
Now, can I ask you about your observations of the extent to which banks are currently complying with these sorts of obligations?
What we've found through the financial counsellors is that certainly the banks are not very proactive in promoting this product, and certainly people that are going in and opening accounts, there's no conversation around their income or possible income, so that there's no opportunities for people then to even know about basic concession accounts. We've had conversations with the bank around, identification for people, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are coming in. The banks are really concerned that they don't want to ask people to identify because they think they're going to be seen as racist, or not actually acting in the best interest of the client. But what I can say is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been asking to identify over a very long period of time, and certainly through a lot of other services like health, schools, universities, and that's because it was around trying to be as much as supportive as possible to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander to close the gap, but also to offer services that would be really appropriate. But certainly at the coalface, very few people are being told about basic bank accounts.
And in your experience, are banks asking Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander customers to identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders?
No, they're not. Simply because of the reasons that I've just said, that they don't want to seem to be not acting in the best interest of the client.
And I take it from the answer you've given that you would regard it as valuable for that practice to change.
Certainly. I mean, we've had lots of conversations with banks where they said, we are doing the best for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander customers, and it's always been the thought was, okay, so you must ask them to identify, and they go, no, well, how do you know that you're working in the best interest of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
Mr. Boyle, could I ask you to comment on those topics? There's a few things in there about identification by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in their dealings with financial services entities, but also about your experiences with the promotion of basic bank accounts.
So the identification issue, I'll begin with that because it would be a great thing, I think, if banks and other institutions were able to identify which customers that they had that were Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, particularly where people lived in remote or regional areas, really assist the bank to be able to direct people to them appropriate policies like the alternative identification arrangements. And I've had some discussions with other people in the financial services industry recently, and one executive was talking to an executive at a different institution, and that other institution said, oh no, we don't have any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander clients. But they actually have no way of knowing whether they do or they don't, and it's very likely that that institution does have Indigenous clients and could benefit from some further thought about how to best service those clients. So I would support the fact that having an identification of people being Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander would certainly benefit, and in particular it would allow institutions to know that they do have Indigenous clients. The basic bank accounts, on the ground in practice, we do come across a lot of low-income earners that are on accounts that charge fees when they might otherwise be eligible for a basic bank account. As I understand it, the banks do have a commitment to provide basic and low-fee accounts to low-income earners, but most often that is happening if an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person themselves identifies themselves to the bank as being someone that is eligible for one of them accounts, and it doesn't seem to have been proactive across the board to try and provide low-income earners with them fee-free accounts.
Yeah. Can I just say that, one of the things that would be really beneficial for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and also for the banks as well, is to be proactive in that space. So, when people's when their income goes into the bank, it's always identified. So you will see on a bank statement, the payments come from Centrelink and it's for New Start, or it comes from families and it's, obviously family tax benefit, that the banks would be proactive about that and say, hey, this person's actually on a low income and on a Centrelink payment, but they've actually got an account that pays fees. We need to contact this person and say, there's a better product for them. That would be really beneficial.
Why is it important for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who live in these communities, Mr. Boyle, I'll ask you this, to have access to fee-free accounts?
A lot of people in very remote Indigenous communities are on substantially low incomes. And so even a small fee of, say, $10 or $20 is quite a significant proportion of people's income if they are in sole receipt of welfare support payments. Or that they are in employment that pays them periodically or at very low amounts. So having them fee-free accounts means that people will have access to the entire proportion of the funds that are placed into their bank account, whereas when people are being charged them fees, sometimes a fee of $20 is 10% of a person's income for the fortnight.
Commissioner, could I tender that draft revised Code of Banking Practice? It may be in evidence from other hearings, but I think it would be useful to have it in evidence for this block of hearings too.
Exhibit 4.142, Proposed Code of Banking Practice, RCD 999900370502.
Now, Mrs. Edwards, sticking with the topic of fees, can I ask you, in your experience, how significant a problem are overdrawn fees for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in remote communities?
Well, if you think about someone that's on a Centrelink benefit that may have overdrawn fees, which could be $6 at a time, that's just continuing every day until it actually picks up that payment. It could possibly be, as Nathan said, 20% of their income, and sort of not understanding that, you not need to not go in and draw too much money out, particularly if there's a direct debit, is just another reason of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people not actually understanding banking products.
Mr. Boyle, would you like to comment on overdrawn fees and their impact on people in these communities?
Yes, we've had reports of very significant overdraft fees, where often people's entire income or a significant proportion of that income, when it goes into their bank account, will be used to pay off that overdraft facility. Some of the overdraft facilities don't have monetary limits, so it can be a person's entire payment that goes to that overdraft, which means that the person becomes trapped in an overdraft cycle, for want of a better term, where they are continuously paying overdraft fees and always receiving less and less of their income.
Yeah. So, at the moment, there is a code of operation that sets out, how a service provider can actually recoup that money. And at the moment, they can only access 10% of a person's income. we're simply saying that, you know, at least 90% people should be able to keep that amount of their income support payments. So people can negotiate with the banks to take a little bit more, but you know, obviously there's a code of operation for a particular reason for people that are on low income, and unfortunately, you know, this has actually been removed in the. So it's not actually included in the 2018 Code of Banking Practice.
Could I just ask you on that point, Mrs. Edwards, to look at a page within the document we just tendered, which is RCD 99900370523. So back to the revised proposed Banking Code of Practice. And could I just ask you to look at clause 181 of that document?
Yes.
So in the new code, are we right in thinking that there will be an obligation to comply with the Code of Operation?
There could possibly, but what we're finding is the Code of Operation is not being used by banks
Yes.
in a systemic way.
Yes, so the obligation will be there, but
Yes.
your experience is that there are difficulties with complying with that obligation.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's correct.
Mr. Boyle, would you like to comment on that?
I don't have direct experience of there being issues. I have heard anecdotally that some people that are on welfare payments as the main source of their income, when they do have overdraft facilities, for example, that sometimes more than 10% of their income is being taken to pay that off, when the Code of Operation would provide an obligation for a financial service provider to make sure that they were leaving the consumer with 90% of that income in order to pay for their essential goods. In
Yes.
terms of direct experience, I don't have a great deal.
And can I ask you, Mr. Boyle, how significant a problem you think dishonour fees are for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in these communities?
Dishonour fees can have quite a significant impact on people in these communities. So dishonour fees, for example, where a direct debit has been set up to take money, a recurrent bill, for example, out of someone's account, because of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's lower level of understanding about how finances operate generally, people sometimes won't know which day the money does go into their account, or they won't understand the way that direct debits work. So what we see, not uncommonly, is that people might have a direct debit set up to come out of their account on the day before their income comes in. So they are repeatedly having to pay them dishonour fees. I've had some very positive experiences with the financial services sector about identifying and resolving them situations. So I can think of one example where I was contacted by someone at the Commonwealth Bank who had noticed a significant number of dishonour fees were being charged in a particular area, and the bank had done some research and identified that it was a postcode that had a significant Indigenous population, and that bank contacted ASIC's Indigenous Outreach Program to ask us, could we work with the bank and with the business that was regularly having them direct debits come out at inappropriate times, to make sure that they did set up the direct debits with the customers on a day that there would likely be money in their account. And so I wonder, regarding direct debits, whether if someone is either identified as being on a low income or on a welfare support payment, whether there couldn't be an obligation on a financial service provider to assist that customer to set up a direct debit at a time when it's more likely that there would be money in their account, because that would definitely reduce the impact of them fees, and it can be quite significant.
So you've referred there to failed direct debit payments. In your experience, are they a common cause of dishonour fees for people in these communities?
Yes, very common.
And do you agree with that, Mrs.
Yes,
Edwards?
I do, yes.
Can I ask both of you, starting with
Just
you,
before
Mrs.
we leave that, are there other causes of dishonour fees other than failed direct debits?
Not that I'm aware of.
No, not that I'm aware of either.
I would have thought
Maybe.
they would all be DDs, direct debits. But
I believe so, because that would be the only time a dishonour fee was charged, if there wasn't money in a bank account. Direct debit failed.
Can I ask you, Mrs. Edwards, whether you think that banks could be doing more to ensure that appropriate fee structures are in place for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in remote and regional communities?
Yes, I think that there is opportunities for banks to work with financial counsellors, and I know that banks do refer customers to financial counsellors around their accounts and how they're using their accounts. Probably being more proactive, particularly around the basic accounts. We know that there are no fees and charges. I wonder though if those basic bank accounts do attract the dishonour fee, and if that is the case, then banks should be working proactively with the customer to actually find out what's actually happening. Nathan mentioned that some of those direct debits could be coming in prior to people getting their income, but we have seen too that it actually does come after the income, because people know that the direct debits are going to be there and they tend to not leave money in there. So one of the things that the banks could be doing is working with people to say, you have this account, maybe set up a bills account where that direct debit would come out so that the money's always in there, as an example.
Mr. Boyle, do you have any comments about how banks could improve their fee structures to assist Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in these communities?
I think that it would be, in terms of fee structures, where there are fees being charged on accounts, it would be great if the financial services sector could provide more information to people about the fee structures and about the fees that can be charged in a language that they can understand, or in a way that they can understand, because regardless of what the fee structure is or how low the fees might be, most accounts do have some type of fee attached to them. Even no fee accounts might have a direct debit dishonour fee, for example. And I think, the biggest thing that could be done would be assisting people to understand the fees that are being charged and making sure that people are aware of fees that may be charged on their account. For example, if there is an informal overdraft, specifically explaining what an overdraft facility is to a customer and making sure that they're aware of how much they will be charged, or potentially on a basic bank account not having any informal overdraft facility at all.
And I'd like to add there that, given that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are very visual, that, some of those resources around bank fees could actually be resources that are visual and very easily explained, rather than having big words around what a fee structure is. If you spoke to an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person and you said, what's the fee structure in your bank, they would probably not even understand what that actually means. So having resources that are really in very plain and very visual would be helpful.
Do either of you see any problem in saying no informal overdrafts on a basic account? Is that going to lead to a problem about which I need to think, do you think?
I think that people are, it's really people's choices, but if I had to take a hard line and think about basic bank accounts, I would probably say no to overdrafts on basic bank accounts.
And I would agree with Lynda that we don't take choice away from people, but in terms of basic bank accounts, there are a particular bank account and you can choose to have one if you're in a low income. If you wanted to access an informal overdraft facility, you could certainly move from your basic bank account into a fee charging one. So I can't see any issue in banning overdraft facilities outright on basic or low fee bank accounts.
And if you wanted a formal overdraft, you'd have to apply, and the bank would have to meet the responsible lending obligations, wouldn't they?
As I understand it, yes.
Correct, yes.
Commissioner, that might be a convenient time for a brief break.
Sure.
Yes.
When do you want me to come back, Ms. Orr?
5:30 would be fine.
Or 25 to?
Sorry, I'm a bit slower. Yes, 25 to would be great. Thank you.
All right. Yes, Ms. Orr.
It's falling down.
I've asked both of you questions about some credit products, about credit cards, but can I ask you some questions about some other consumer lending products? You may have heard in the opening statement my reference to car loans and the importance of car loans within these communities. Is that something that either of you are able to comment on, the importance of the car and therefore the importance of finance to acquire a car in these communities?
I can start. Yeah, I can probably start with that. No, given the remoteness of many communities, a car is really important to people in that community, and we know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander will usually commonly access a car yard to purchase a car, but what we found is that car dealerships will often take advantage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people by giving them car loans with high interest rates. We'll give them, cars that are actually not lemons, and certainly we'll sell them, insurance that it really is not worth the paper that it's written on. We know that through the financial counsellors that some car dealers will actually drive into communities with trucks with cars on them to sell them when they know that royalty payments are coming into the community, and usually these cars then break down within a couple of weeks, and obviously being in a remote community, where do you go to get your car fixed, and so the cars never get fixed. In regards to the financial counsellors, many of these loan contracts are really irresponsible lending, and that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are given these loans that is far in excess of what their income is. There's, where there's no savings history, they have very little opportunities to pay off the debt, and then are left obviously with high debts.
Mr. Boyle, do you observe difficulties with car financing in these communities?
Yes, and cars are almost an essential item for some people, particularly when they're at a significant distance from services like hospitals or other places. So people really do rely on having access to a motor vehicle. Because people are on lower incomes and in very remote communities, geographically isolated from mainstream lenders, that means that often people are trying to finance their car in other ways, and one way that it's common for people in very remote communities to finance cars is through informal credit provision like book up, which is often at the moment not captured by the National Consumer Credit Protection Act. So we do see people being given quite significant loans on varying terms that aren't subject to the responsible lending requirements of our legislation.
You've mentioned book up a couple of times this morning, and I mentioned it yesterday in the opening statement as well. Could you explain exactly what book up is?
Yes, so book up is like an informal store account, and in its simplest terms, if I can't afford bread and milk, I go to the shop, they write down bread and milk and the cost, and then I come and pay that off when I've got cash available in my bank account. But in some disadvantageous book up operations, we're seeing terms such as requiring consumers to leave their debit card and their personal identification number with the store, and then we're seeing people remove all or nearly all of consumers' income from their account each fortnight to reduce that debt. And because book up in and of itself isn't captured at the moment necessarily as a financial product unless it meets certain requirements, or it's captured as a financial product but not as a credit facility subject to regulation by the legislation. To be subject to regulation by the Credit Act, you must have a fee or a charge for providing the service, and the credit must be provided for a period of more than 62 days. And so what we do see is commonly where people are entering book up arrangements and they don't want to be subject to the regulation of the Credit Act, that they are just keeping records in such a format that we can't possibly prove that fees are being charged or that the debt's being deferred for a period of time.
And you refer in your statement to work that ASIC is doing with the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet in relation to potential forms of regulation for book up. Could you explain what that work is?
Yes, at the moment, consumer advocates have been raising book up issues with us for a long time, and we've been consulting widely with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people around an appropriate way to regulate that service. And so we are trying to bring a range of best practice requirements into the provision of book-up, including record-keeping requirements. So if there are record-keeping requirements, it'll be much easier for ASIC to take action where communities are identifying unconscionable conduct with us, and we're at a stage where that consultation will begin probably in the second half of this year.
Is book-up a practice that you'd like to make any observations about, Mrs Edwards?
Yes, so we have seen financial counsellors have reported book-up, and we know that within some communities the practice of book-up is actually keeping people in a cycle of financial hardship, because normally what would happen is that they would book up until they get their payday, and that when they actually have to pay the account at the store, because then they won't let them use the store until they pay their account, it's majority of their benefits would actually go on book-up, and so then for the next fortnight then they have to depend on book-up again. So it is certainly a predatory practice, and certainly a lot of consumers in that space are not even given the opportunity to see any transaction records of what they may have purchased. I know I can't certainly remember what I purchased 2 weeks ago. Certainly people are not actually being given that opportunity, and as far as that we're aware of.
I did want to say about book-up though that ASIC's view is that it is often, if it operates according to best practice principles, that it is a very good service that can assist people to manage their income between paydays. And I myself grew up using book-up accounts, and if we didn't have access to book-up, then we would have gone without things like bread and milk. So ASIC's view is that where it does operate according to best practice principles, that it can be a very good service for Indigenous communities to make sure they have access to food and other essential items between paydays. But it's where that behaviour is not operating according to best practice principles, and sometimes is deliberately falling outside of regulation by ASIC, that we do see really unscrupulous behaviour happening.
And the financial counsellors are actually saying that as well, that in those cases it is beneficial. It's where the predatory behaviour comes in, that it's where people are put at a disadvantage.
So, Mr Boyle, you referred to unscrupulous behaviour, and Mrs Edwards, you've referred to predatory behaviour. Are there other consumer lending products that you see that form of behaviour in connection with in these communities?
Yeah, so we know that it's not under the terms of reference for this commission, but payday lending and consumer leases have a huge negative impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We know that that people often get a payday loan for a very short period of time, so it's up to 16 days and 1 year. And we have seen that these loans, the interest rate on those loans are really, really high. Consumer leases are the same. Consumer leases are where people go and get white goods such as furniture, fridges, and we've seen that the contract price of those goods compared to the retail price and the value of the goods the gap is quite considerable, where we have seen cases where a person has got a washing machine, for example, and it could be the value of the good could be $600, but through a consumer lease they could be paying $2,000 for that particular washing machine. And we've known that in some cases the annual interest on some of those consumer leases could be anything up to 884%, and both of those practices are very predatory. They're very unfair, and it really does show irresponsible lending. And we see where some of these contracts actually, when are still being charged for goods even after the lease has expired. So certainly it has been it's one of those products. These are both products that actually then impact on people's finances, and where that they have a little choice, because for consumer leases, people pay via Centrelink. by Centrepay. So, what these companies do is, you can get this. So we know that they drive into communities with the washing machine in trucks. You can get this washing machine. It only costs, $30 a fortnight. You don't have to pay it straight away. Here's a Centrepay form. All you have to do is sign it. You'll be fine. And people are then stuck in those contracts for those consumer leases.
Mr Boyle, would you like to comment on those matters?
ASIC receives a significant amount of reports of misconduct in relation to both consumer lease providers and small amount credit contract providers, which are otherwise referred to as payday lenders. And we do see some behaviours that are less than ethical, I guess, in that we've heard reports of senior members of communities, elders, for example, that are trusted and respected, being provided with incentives to introduce the company to other members of the community. And when that happens, they're more likely to enter into an agreement because they're being provided with that service by someone that they trust. So, yes, we do get a lot of reports of misconduct, and we've had a range of outcomes against consumer lease providers that have been breaching the laws that we administer. I did just also want to step back to car loans very briefly, because I did talk about car loans that are unregulated at the moment in terms of people accessing them through BookUp. But ASIC has also taken action where motor vehicle finance providers have been providing car loans that are regulated to Indigenous consumers. And one of those was the Chenick litigation that we ran in Yarrabah, which is a community outside of Cairns. And in that matter, we had it raised with us that consumers were being given loans that almost from the first time that they had to make a repayment, they were unable to afford the repayments. And people had been asked to provide cash deposits of $2,000 or $3,000 in order to purchase the motor vehicles. They were then often charged brokerage fees of between $550 and $990 for an introduction to the lender. And the lender was owned by the same individual that also owned the car yard. And what we seen in that case was that often people would default on the repayments under the loan, and then that car would be repossessed from them and sold under the same terms to other people in the community. And those loans were being charged at an interest rate of 48%, which is the highest allowable interest rate. So we do see quite predatory practices in that instance. And again, that was the matter I spoke about before, where people did tell us that the higher the interest rate, the better, as they understood it in entering them car loans. So we do see in the regulated space as well some predatory behaviour. And what people said to ASIC when they were reporting the misconduct was that the car provider knew that there would be some money coming into the Aboriginal communities around Cairns at that time, and that's why the behaviour began.
What was the nature of the money that was coming into the community at that time?
Cyclone Yassi had been through not long before, and a lot of people in the community received cyclone emergency relief payments of $2,000 or $3,000 for the damage to their houses.
All right. Can we move from consumer lending products to a different form of financial product, which is funeral insurance? Now, Mrs. Edwards, could we start by having you explain the cultural significance of funerals for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
Yes, certainly. So, given that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have strong kinship values and cultural obligation, the process around death is actually called sorry business. And sorry business is the journey that begins when a person is dying until they actually pass away. And it could actually continue after their death as well. So for Torres Strait Islander people, the laying of the headstone a year after burial is a very important traditional ceremony. Sorry business is a very ceremonial practice, particularly in remote communities that are very traditional. It may involve the whole community, and we know, and financial counsellors have reported that at time of sorry business, then there's no actual work or programs or activities that can be run in these communities. And sorry business for many of these traditional communities could go for weeks, as I explained earlier in my statement. But, you know, when whole communities come together to grieve, that means that more people will need to be fed, and it's usually up to the hosting families that would actually have to provide food and shelter for people to be able to participate in these ceremonial practices. And what financial counsellors have found in their work with clients, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients, is prioritising of funeral payments over everything else is quite high. And so, you know, people will stop paying less for food because they actually don't want to, you know, not pay for funeral expenses because of the ceremonial practice that comes with it. So yeah, it's actually quite a cultural practice that happens not just only in traditional communities and remote communities, it certainly happens in urban communities as well, where families do come together to grieve as a whole.
And in your view, is there a relationship between the cultural significance of sorry business and the uptake by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of funeral insurance?
Yes, certainly, because the importance of the actual funeral ceremony. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people know that there's a cost to, you know, someone passing away, and they certainly don't want to leave that cost for family. We know that that the majority of people that have these funeral products also have those contracts to cover their children or their grandchildren. In some cases, for grandmothers, we do know that there are grandmothers that have their grandchildren on contract as well that are, you know, could be there as soon as they are born.
The contracts you're referring to there are funeral insurance contracts?
Yes, they are, yes. And, you know, in the past, these products were sold door to door to people, and the way that they were sold to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people was really around those kinship obligations and cultural obligations. You know, an example of that is ACBF, so Aboriginal Community Benefit Fund, who went door to door selling products to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So those people thought that service was an Aboriginal service, so were very trusting and wanted to sign up because of the ceremonial practice of funerals. And in some cases, people of, you know, of dark complexion were used to sell that product because it meant a relationship would start immediately because the trust in another, you know, whether it's an Aboriginal person or a dark-skinned person. And the fact is that, you know, the conversations with leading Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander services within communities around, you know, displaying posters of the service then led people to believe that, okay, this is actually an Aboriginal service that I can actually trust, and I will, you know, become a member of that service and pay into that fund.
Now, Mr. Boyle, can I ask you to comment on a number of themes from Mrs. Edwards' answers to my questions? Firstly, about the cultural significance of sorry business. Secondly, about the relationship of that cultural significance to the uptake of funeral insurance. And thirdly, about the practices for the selling of funeral insurance that Mrs. Edwards has commented on.
Absolutely. So, sorry business is a very significant cultural aspect for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and funerals in general, I think, for all people are quite a significant time. I think both because of the cultural obligation to make sure that sorry business occurs in a culturally appropriate way, and that certain ceremonial business is conducted, that does increase people's reliance on making sure that they have appropriate amounts of finance to cover the cost of funerals as they occur. But also, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have generally a much lower life expectancy than other people, and because of our cultural obligations to demand share and to share resources, often Aboriginal people have an obligation to provide financial support for a larger range of funerals than just their immediate family. And I think because funerals are quite expensive, I think the figure that you quoted yesterday was somewhere between $4,000 and $15,000 on average, and people in very remote Indigenous communities in particular tend to be on quite low incomes. So people know that it's a significant cost, and they're going to be concerned about making sure that they meet that. So that does encourage them to think about ways that that they might pay for the funeral. So both the cultural significance and the cost of funerals and the number of funerals that people are obligated to contribute to increases people's reliance on funeral products. And I apologise.
I'm sorry, by giving you 3 topics to deal with, that was very unfair. The third topic that I asked you to consider was the sales practices.
Yeah, the sales practices we have seen, and I think Lynda pointed to the Aboriginal Community Benefit Fund, and as an example, that company between 2015 and 16 was sending out large posters to Aboriginal people that were members of their fund, and the posters used words like awarded or a certificate or achieved, and said the amount of money that a person had reached the benefit amount of. So maybe they've reached a $20,000 benefit amount, for example. But the policies that were being issued at that time were funeral expenses only policies. So where the certificate might have said people are awarded, you've reached $30,000, this certificate is awarded to you for reaching a $30,000 benefit, where that funeral on average cost between $7,000 and $15,000, then $30,000 was really a misrepresentation of the total amount of benefit that people would be able to obtain under the policy. And we receive regular reports both from consumers themselves and from consumer advocates that people seeing them posters and they seen quite significant amounts of money. They'd never had access to $30,000 before, for example, and that led them to sign up to the posters. We've also had them same reports that Lynda spoke about, where people have thought that the Aboriginal Community Benefit Fund in particular was an Aboriginal organisation and that it was set up to benefit them, and not knowing that it was a private company. We've heard from consumers that people have conflated a previous type of fund that used to be run by the New South Wales Local Aboriginal Land Council, for example, which was a contributory funeral fund. And people often don't realise that that's not the same as ACBF from reports that we receive. We also had reports that ACBF representatives were not always explaining the key features of the products, and that many people didn't realise that they were only covered for funeral insurance. That policy also had suicide exclusions previously, and we received reports from both consumer advocates and Indigenous consumers themselves where people are quite upset once someone has passed away through suicide. The other ways that we do see them kind of policies being sold is over the telephone, and certainly we see other insurance providers and funeral product providers contacting people over the telephone and signing them up to these kind of policies. And over the telephone, we've seen in the sale of funeral insurance products, I think I mentioned earlier, Clearview Life Assurance Limited, where we've seen gratuitous concurrence play out in leading people to enter them contracts when they did not intend to as well. So the marketing practices have obviously had an impact on encouraging people to enter into those contracts.
Mrs. Edwards, could I ask you about some matters that you refer to in your statement in connection with funeral insurance? You refer to situations where individuals that Financial Counselling Australia has dealt with hold multiple funeral insurance policies. Could you explain that?
Yes, so what we've seen is that when a client actually comes in and they disclose that they have funeral insurance, and under further investigation we see that funeral insurance has been supplied to the client, even though that the company was aware that they also had funeral coverage by the local Aboriginal organisations, particularly under royalty payments, and so the second insurance was really not needed for those clients because they were already covered, but they still sold the product to the clients in regards to that.
And you refer to issues that clients raise with Financial Counselling Australia about policies not covering all aspects of sorry business. Could you explain that?
That's right. So a majority of the funeral products, insurance products that are around now don't take into account the journey that sorry business takes. So it's not just really about the burial. There's all other things that are involved in that, and certainly around family and whole communities coming together. When people were signed up to some of these products, they thought that it covered the whole cost of funerals, including wakes, and obviously it didn't. So they were receiving their certificates that had, you have $20,000, you know, that you've paid into your funeral fund, when they think that, oh, okay, if the funeral's only $8,000, then I will actually get $12,000 refunded to me, and it didn't. It doesn't work that way.
Now, Mr. Boyle, are you aware of situations in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have had their funeral insurance policy cancelled for non-payment of premiums?
Absolutely, yeah. We see that not infrequently, where people are unable to keep up with their premiums and have policies cancelled as a result of that. I'd also like to make comment on what Lynda just said as well, which is that we do see quite a large number of people that are taking out funeral insurance policies where they also have their funeral covered through another means. So there are a range of land councils that will provide funeral benefit payments to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Still in New South Wales, and as an example, there's up to $1,500 towards funerals that can be provided from the Aboriginal Land Council and a range of other government bodies. We also have areas where funeral and sorry business practices are covered under the native title agreements or under funds that are received from native title agreements. And we have seen people who have purchased funeral insurance policies when the entire cost of their sorry business is already covered through a native title agreement. So we often see people getting into these kind of funeral products where they are already covered. Again, and there are some difficulties accessing deceased estates under superannuation, but an increasing proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do have superannuation when they pass away. And under superannuation, often there is a death benefit or other kinds of insurance that can assist in paying for these products. So we see people entering into products that where their funerals are already covered. We see people, as you've just asked, having their products cancelled as a result of not making payments, but also within the first 5 years of owning a funeral insurance product across the board, not just for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but ASIC's research report found that 55% of all funeral insurance policies are cancelled in the first 5 years of the policies having been opened. And 65% of those policies are cancelled by the consumer directly, as opposed to being cancelled as a result of missed payment of fees. And to me, I guess that indicates that potentially the consumer either didn't particularly want to enter into that contract to begin with, or didn't have the terms of the contract explained to them adequately, and so they've made a decision within that first 12-month period to cancel the policies. And we also see that funeral insurance policies, people often pay a significant amount more in insurance premiums or for the policies they're entering into than the benefit that they'll ever obtain under the policy. And just as an example of that, in our 2014 research report into funeral insurance in Australia, we found that across the board for all Australians that less than 5% of funeral insurance products have been held for more than 8 years. So anyone who has had a funeral insurance product for greater than 8 years, 95% of them people have paid more than any benefit they'll ever get out.
Now, can I ask you, Mrs. Edwards, how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people tend to pay the payments under their funeral insurance policies? Is it done by direct debit? How do the payments occur?
There are a couple of ways now. Initially, with ACBF, it was via centre pay. So the majority nowadays for funeral insurance is paid by direct debit. And that's usually set up by the company that's selling the product. So, relying on cultural obligation and people's responsibility to community and family, people are signing up to these products and not really sort of understanding what the products are about. I'm well aware of a case in our community where a mother has signed onto funeral products for herself and her 5 children for $44 a fortnight, and her main source of income is New Start on Centrelink. And so we can see that the importance of people, doing this. So and they're not actually understanding the direct debit system, then actually puts them at risk of not paying for their funeral insurance, and then at risk of actually losing their contract.
In your experience, are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in remote communities aware of how to cancel a direct debit? They do know that they can be cancelled. The challenge around that is with many financial services is that they tell Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that they cannot cancel their direct debits even though it's their account and their money. They suggest to them that they have to actually go back to the creditor, and it's at the creditor's responsibility to cancel the direct debit, when we know under the code that that they can actually cancel their own direct debit, and this is the problem with staff in banking services at the coalface of actually not knowing what the rules are around direct debits. Can I ask you to look at another page of the revised Code of Banking Practice, the draft RCD 99900370517. See that the obligations that are proposed under the revised code include in paragraph 134 an obligation upon request to give a list of direct debits and recurring payments on a person's account for up to the previous 13 months.
Yes.
And you see in paragraph 135 the obligation to promptly process a request to cancel direct debits.
Yes.
And the obligation in paragraph 136 to promptly assist if a request is made to investigate an unauthorised direct debit.
Yes.
And information that needs to be provided in connection with any cancellation or complaint referred to in paragraph 137.
Yes.
In your experience, are banks complying with the sorts of obligations that we see here?
Not systemically, no. So what we're seeing is that banks are refusing people to cancel direct debits, and when a direct debit does go out, it's cancelled. When it is cancelled, it takes a very long time then to retrieve the money that's been taken, and so financial counsellors are dealing with this on a daily basis, I would imagine.
Mr Boyle, can I ask you to comment firstly on this issue in relation to cancellations of direct debits?
Cancellations of direct debits, we have heard where people have had difficulties cancelling direct debits. I haven't come across it as much of a significant issue as Lynda has, but Lynda hears more directly about that issue than I do. But in terms of direct debits being listed on people's bank statements, particularly in communities where English is not a first language and where a majority of the community might not speak or speak very functional English or be able to read in English, then what we often find is that people don't realise that they have got direct debits set up, that there might have been a direct debit that's been recurring for quite a number of years, and we hear reports that people just don't realise, and when it's raised with them, do you realise that you're paying for this consumer lease, for example, under a direct debit, and people are, no, I've had that lounge for 5 years, and under the terms of the contract, it rolls over. If the person doesn't cancel the consumer lease or the direct debit at the end of the contract, it just starts a new contract. So I think it's certainly a good obligation that banks will be happy to provide a list of direct debits and recurring payments for the previous 13 months. The obligation at the moment has the onus on a consumer to request that information, and potentially it would be good to reverse that onus and to have banks provide a general list of them recurring payments to people proactively, rather than the onus being on the consumer to request a copy of that statement. And certainly if that was a separate document as opposed to being somewhere contained at the back of a bank statement, for people with lower levels of literacy, that might make them more aware of what direct debits that they are paying for through their account if it comes in a separate communication.
And we heard Mrs Edwards refer before, in answering my question about methods of payment for funeral insurance, Mrs Edwards referred to, in the past, funeral insurance payments sometimes being made via CentrePay. Is that something that you've seen as well?
Absolutely. I think that it would be fair to say that a majority of the funeral insurance contracts that we've had raised with us were being paid through CentrePay prior to funeral insurance being removed as an item that could be paid for using CentrePay, which is the bill paying service operated by the Department of Human Services. And I'll just let you know how that works. It was designed as being a bill paying mechanism to assist Indigenous people and other low income earners, so Centrelink recipients, to make sure that they were able to pay for essential items like rent and electricity. And that bill paying mechanism takes money out of people's welfare income and pays that to their landlord, for example. It'll pay their rent before the remainder of their Centrelink income comes to their bank account. So it's a way of ensuring that people can manage their budgets. But we did see a lot of people prior to funeral insurance being removed from the CentrePay system that were paying for their funeral insurance through CentrePay. And even the information that's given about CentrePay deductions has recently improved. But prior to that, several years ago, when we first started receiving reports of people paying for funeral insurance through CentrePay, CentrePay deductions were not itemised on people's Centrelink income statements. It used to just say CentrePay $300, for example, and that might have covered your rent, your electricity, and 2 consumer leases and a funeral insurance product. So once people started to get itemised listings of the payments they were making through their CentrePay deductions, we've seen a lot of people cancelling contracts that they had forgotten that they were paying for through that mechanism. And I believe that direct debit is now the most common way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do pay for funeral insurance.
Can I turn now to ask you questions about one other form of financial product, which is superannuation? Both of you have made some references already in the course of your evidence to difficulties encountered by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in dealing with superannuation funds. So could I ask each of you to address in turn what you see as the major issues for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in dealing with their superannuation entitlements?
Firstly, can I say that issues around superannuation take up an enormous amount of time for financial counsellors and capability workers in assisting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in remote and regional communities. And we know that the challenges and barriers around that is obviously low numeracy and literacy levels. So many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in these communities do not understand how superannuation works, and really don't have the confidence to interact with the system without assistance. We know that there are lots of issues around proving identity. In relation to proving who they are, and obviously for intestate accounts. We know that through that the kinship relationships within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play a huge role and relate to the beneficiaries under a policy. And obviously, and Nathan alluded to this earlier, is the life expectancy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is significantly lower than other Australians. We know that many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in regional and remote communities do die intestate. So, superannuation is very broad, and some of the work that financial counsellors are doing is basically trying to find superannuation in the first place. This can be, quite a challenge if people can't remember where they worked or where they were, not sure what their tax file number is, and so going through all the paperwork with that, explaining the words that are in that are associated with claiming superannuation, or is always a challenge because of English being a second or third language. So the major problems that most of the financial counsellors are seeing is the delay that it takes to be able to make a decision about any type of income or payments that people can actually apply for. Financial counsellors are saying that not all forms are sent out at the same time. So you fill in one form, you send that away, or you have to fill in this form, so then that comes. We know that in majority of superannuation funds, all the forms are all different, and there's different ways of claiming, the different wording. So it's quite a challenge, and as one of the ways that I can sort of explain superannuation is that it's like you're trying to swim upstream of a river that's really, really heavy and hard. Trying to negotiate the system of superannuation for Aboriginal people is like that. And after a while, you just become too tired. You're just tired from swimming upstream, and so you just give up. And by giving up, you're losing out on things that you could actually benefit your life. For example, insurance, if you actually have a disability, or you're applicable for a TPD, for example. So the superannuation system is quite a really system that is really hard to navigate.
Mr. Boyle.
Yes, access to superannuation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is a particular passion of mine, and the same kind of issues in relation to access to that service exist as for the whole range of other financial services. So identification issues that I spoke about earlier exist, but even where someone does have a full set of identity documents, then having them copied, having access to a photocopier that will copy them to a standard that will be accepted by financial service providers can be quite difficult. Some superannuation companies will have a requirement that they're certified by a certain person, and having access to someone to appropriately certify the documents in very remote communities can be very difficult. And as Lynda just said, all superannuation funds have different requirements about what kinds of identification documents that they'll accept and what the certification process is. So that can be quite difficult for people. We see inside of superannuation an underutilisation of some of the insurance that is captured in superannuation products, such as TPD insurance. It's not unusual for me to hear reports of financial counsellors meeting with Indigenous people and finding out that they are totally and permanently disabled and have a policy that they can make a claim for under their superannuation. And unfortunately, in some of those instances, we've heard that the time period to make a claim under the TPD policy has expired because people weren't made aware that it existed. For deceased estates in particular, it is quite difficult at the moment. I referred before to the range of work type activities that are unpaid that are undertaken by people, Indigenous people in particular, living in remote communities. So often when a family member passes away, the family aren't aware of whether or not the person will have superannuation. They will think, yes, my relative worked, but they won't know whether or not that was work that did provide a superannuation benefit for the person. So the way that people need to locate what superannuation might have existed for the deceased family member is often by contacting the Australian Taxation Office, because superannuation funds are required to report to the ATO when they hold super in a member's name. And at the moment, it's quite a difficult process for someone, because in order for the ATO to provide that personal information about what superannuation funds were reporting to you in the deceased relative's name, they require people to either have a will that shows that they're the appropriate person to talk to, or to seek letters of administration for the estate. That can be a costly process, and it can be a minimum of a couple of $1,000s, which makes it difficult for people to even find out whether or not that superannuation exists. And then once it does exist, as I said before, our kinship structures don't always align to the people who are allowed to receive the benefits from superannuation from deceased estates. Regularly, we will hear of people that are trying to access either their own superannuation or that of a deceased person, and that they will give up. They will just think that it's too hard, and that is really disappointing for me, because I think that there is a general assumption in the broader population that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people don't always have superannuation, but there are people in remote communities. I was in the Unlawful Pit and Judda Lounge just 4 weeks ago, and we came across people who had very significant superannuation balances, more than $100,000, and that is their money, and they should be able to access that the same as everyone else. They've worked, they've made contributions to superannuation, and unfortunately at the moment, there isn't enough assistance being provided to people to make sure that they do get the benefit of that superannuation.
Mr. Boyle, could you explain some of the work that you've been involved with to try and address some of the issues that you've just explained?
Yes, absolutely. And I certainly want to point out that there's a range of other people and organisations that have been involved as well. But I think I raised previously when I was in Lockhart River on different business back in, I think it was around 2012 that I was up there. We came across a significant number of people that did have superannuation that had reached a condition of release, that were unable to access that at the time. Most of those members were from a superannuation fund called Q Super. And so we came back and spoke at ASIC about how we might be able to help people to access their superannuation, and we decided to take an executive from Q Super, the head of technical operations at the time, Lynn Melser, to Lockhart River to ask her to try and assist Aboriginal people to access their own fund. And I think Lynn will not mind me saying that when she was first invited, her response was that we treat all of our members equally. We certainly treat Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people equally. Don't worry, we're not treating people any differently. But once she did come to the community, she, at the end of the first day, said, "This is outrageous. We are treating people equally, but that's not meaning they're equally able to access our services, and they're our members, and we have an obligation to provide them with funds." As a result of that and other work, consumer advocates for many years have been raising concerns with superannuation access, that the industry, to their great credit, decided to do some work around this, and they formed an industry Indigenous superannuation working group, which has now held 2 annual conferences to have a look at Indigenous access and engagement issues around superannuation, and to increase identification, increase the ability for people to identify themselves, when they don't meet the standard 100 points of identification. ASIC continues to work with the superannuation industry by trying to take senior representatives from funds out to Aboriginal communities so that they can really experience how them policies are affecting people on the ground, and whether or not the policies that are in place at a head office level are appropriate for consumers on the ground. And we've seen a range of funds make quite significant changes to their policies and procedures. So, for example, again, I'll use the example of Q Super, but they have identified postcodes in their region that have a significant Indigenous population, and they have then worked with the Australian Taxation Office to find superannuation that has been transferred to the Australian Taxation Office as lost super, and then they've proactively, as a fund, worked with community organisations in them postcodes to reunite people with their superannuation. Lost super is another very significant form, and I think in the Kimberleys, which is another remote area of Australia, there's currently $19.2 million of lost superannuation in that area, a significant proportion of that which would be for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And whilst there is not data to show this, we would think that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people become lost members at a higher rate than other people. And that's because someone becomes a lost member when their fund has tried to communicate with them twice and the letter, for example, has been returned to sender. Because of the inefficient postal services in remote communities, a lot of people are having them communications returned to sender, and then as a result of that, having superannuation transferred to the ATO as lost super.
Mrs Edwards, would you like to comment further on any of the superannuation related issues that you see in light of Mr Boyle's answer?
Yep, certainly, as financial counsellors that are on the ground and assisting people in reconnecting with their superannuation, and then obviously assisting them making claims. We do have some examples of where it's just been, really difficult for financial counsellors to work with superannuation funds. So, some financial counsellors say it can take months for a fund to make a decision about an income protection or a TPD claim or a death benefit. For example, one financial counsellor reported that it took 18 months for a TPD claim to be approved for a client who had end-stage renal failure and permanent paralysis on one side as a result of a stroke. Another reported it also took 18 months of TPD claim for a client who had emphysema and a back injury. We know that there's onerous requests for information, a fund requesting a copy of a resume for an Aboriginal client. It would be highly unusual for an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person in a regional and a remote community to have a resume. We hear stories of an old man living in a remote community. A fund requested his entire work history since leaving school, including his trainings and qualifications. Requesting copies of payslips for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that may not have them, because they may not be clear about the employer who employed them or the date that they last worked. So one older man making a claim for a TPD payment was forced to chase an employment termination letter from an employer he had worked for 6 years previously, after the fund refused to accept his claim because he couldn't nominate the exact day he last worked there. So there's lots of, identification is another issue. One financial counsellor had spoken to the superannuation fund and had pointed them to impose the AUSTRAC identification requirements, and the fund told the financial counsellor who was helping the Aboriginal man that they'd never heard of the AUSTRAC guidance and the statement by referee. And he could not use the form to prove his identity. Later in the same claim, the trustees for the fund refused to pay out the money unless the old man, the fellow, actually provided his form of identification. Funds losing paperwork, we're hearing that all the time. And the fact is that most of the superannuation funds are not very proactive when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander super accounts. We know that if those funds have very little money in them, that the possibility of losing the insurance that's attached to that superannuation fund is very likely for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So, this is one of the issues where superannuation funds also don't ask for people to identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. If that was a requirement for the fund, they would actually be able to see that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may not be working but have a super fund would certainly be able to access their insurance. So we have a case where a client was $10 away from having his superannuation account closed, even though he had $120,000 in insurance in that actual fund. So the financial counsellor was able to capture that for that particular person who was actually trying to apply for a TPD because he was sick, and his employer had actually told him that he needed to go and see a CDP employer because he was too sick to work. And not all funds have the same forms for early release or the same processes for early release of super. For financial counsellors, this means a lot more work in being able to assist people that need to access that through either financial hardship or medical reasons.
Could I also comment as well on that early release through hardship? As Lynda's pointed out, the life expectancy of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is much lower. ASIC hasn't formally considered the position on life expectancy and the preservation age of superannuation, but my personal perspective is that because of the inherent design of the superannuation system, the greatest growth in member balances happens in the last 10 years of having that account because of the compound interest. So I think it would be disadvantageous to reduce the preservation age, and that I want to make clear is not a formal ASIC position, but where I see there being greater benefit is around the early release and perhaps having Aboriginality or indigeneity as a factor that could be considered in determining whether or not superannuation should be released early for hardship purposes or for total and permanent disability as an example. Lynda just mentioned renal failure, and we do have significant amounts of kidney disease and of type 2 diabetes in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And at the moment, it's very difficult for people to certify their illness to the satisfaction of their superannuation fund. Often funds will require people to have 2 independent medical experts. Many communities in remote areas are only serviced by the flying doctor service, for example. And so it's almost impossible for a very ill person to get 2 medical professionals to certify that. And also, at the stage where someone is considered to have a terminal illness that would allow them to receive their Centrelink payments, that's often once they are at the very end stage of receiving dialysis treatments, and they often don't receive the payment at a time when they can utilise it. So I think that some more thinking could be done around the definition of total and permanent disability, and that where people are on, do have significant renal issues or significantly advanced type 2 diabetes, that potentially Aboriginality could be used, given the lower life expectancy, as a factor that made it more likely for a superannuation fund to provide early access. However, obviously with all things it's quite complex, and I would encourage the superannuation industry to have a conversation with members that they are releasing or to government departments involved in the hardship process to make sure they really understand the circumstance of the Indigenous consumer that is requesting access for hardship. One concern for me has been the conversations in industry at the moment about potentially bringing in early access as a result of domestic violence, and in my experience, in remote Indigenous communities in particular, where people are in domestic violence relationships, the perpetrator can try and force people to try and access their payments early to get that off them. So if it became known that you can access your superannuation early as a result of domestic violence, my concern is that that might exacerbate people's personal situations. So whilst I think that it should be made easier for people to access their superannuation early, I think that funds need to keep in mind the circumstances that their members might be living in, and make sure that they take due diligence before providing the payment to make sure it is going to benefit their member. One of the other things that I wanted to say is that superannuation for a lot of remote Indigenous people, a lot of people were subject to indentured labour policies under previous government policies, and that meant that significant proportions of their income were placed in government trust accounts. That's referred colloquially to as stolen wages. And when we're talking to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about superannuation, they kind of tend to contextualise that as being stolen wages. It's quite difficult sometimes for people who have had their wages taken from them to learn about a bank account that they can only access once they are old, and that they hear many of their family members passing away before they've got the benefit from. So the education around what superannuation is and how it can benefit people, we try and do as much as we can at ASIC to do that. We've got a couple of animations that raise awareness of that. We go out, I was out 4 weeks ago and did live interpreted sessions with Pidgin language speakers about what superannuation is. But that is another reason that people will give up at what might seem like a relatively small hurdle. So you might think if someone has $35,000 in superannuation and they've been told, oh, you didn't meet the identification requirements, why wouldn't they try again? But for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, they think often, and it's reported to us, why would I try again? That money's been stolen, it's gone. They're not going to let me access, so people will stop trying to access that at the first service. And one really proactive thing that has been happening in this space, it's the last thing I think I'll mention, is that First Nations Foundation, a financial literacy charity that works specifically with Aboriginal people, has partnered with some of the superannuation industry bodies and has been funded by them to run a big super day out, which is a bit of a road show that goes and assists to provide that direct access to superannuation to Indigenous consumers. So whilst there are difficulties, there are some beneficial things, and I really do want to point out that the superannuation industry, as a subset of the financial services sector, really has been making efforts to improve Indigenous people's access.
And if I could just make some points, Nathan just mentioned First Nations Foundation in regards to the Big Super Day Out, and within our Financial Counselling Australia's partnership with First Nations people, there are some considerable points that they've raised in regards to superannuation. And if I may, if I could just go through a couple of those points. They say that for most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, super will be their largest asset and only savings. If you are an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person and you live remotely, you have about a 2% chance of navigating the super system. And Australians, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, pay service through super to the tune of $31 billion per year, but are not receiving services that they actually need. And in 2018, First Nation Foundation has found that no one can actually answer the question, will Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have enough super for retirement because of the identity issue? And I think they're really important points for us to consider.
Now, in concluding, both of you have referred to a number of changes that you think could be made to improve the engagement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in regional and remote communities with financial services entities. But can I ask each of you, starting with you, Mrs. Edwards, what is the single most important change that you think should be made?
There's a lot of things that I'd like to be able to say, certainly around, what would be really beneficial in this space. But if I had to pick a couple of things, if that's okay.
Have to, Mrs. Edwards.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would say that to ensure that any codes and legislation that is for financial services is to make a requirement for those services to be really proactive in working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and particularly for that knowledge of those requirements to be able to be known from the executive right to the coalface, so that everyone and there's training and information around that, so that the coalface people are working appropriately with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I suppose for Financial Counselling Australia, considering that we are regularly have clients referred to us from financial services and also from energy companies, that government consider a levy on those services to be able to assist Financial Counselling Australia and financial counsellors to do their job on the ground.
Mr. Boyle, what about you? What are the things that you think would make the most difference to deal with all of the issues that you've identified today?
Yes, and whilst it's not a bank-specific thing, I would like to second Lynda's comment that greater funding for financial counsellors from the industry would be a real benefit, because we do see that a significant proportion of Indigenous people in remote and regional communities are unable to navigate financial services without assistance. But there are a range of policies like the AUSTRAC alternative guidance and some other policies across the financial services sector that are well known by the industry and that there is a commitment to at that head office level. I think the biggest change that would really benefit things for Indigenous consumers is if there was a concerted effort to make sure that all of the members of that service, right down to the coalface, to the people who are on the telephone or who are dealing face-to-face with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, are aware of the policies that have been agreed to by the industry. And what I would really love to see is more executives from banks and more policy makers from banks and from financial services institutions who are making these policies to go out to Aboriginal communities and to see how the policies are actually working on the ground, because we've seen with Lynn Melser and we've seen with a range of other executives that have visited communities with me that they might think that they have great policies, and they may very well have very good policies, but it is only once they get out onto the ground and they're helping their own customers or their own members to access their own services where they realise the difficulties in them policies. And so the more policymakers and executives that go out and see how their institution is working on the ground in communities, I think that that's when we see the greatest change and the greatest increase in financial inclusion. So I think, yeah, I would really like to see more policymakers go out and see how their policies are working.
Thank you for your assistance. I have no further questions, Commissioner.
Thank you, Ms. Hall. Mr. McIntyre, is there anything you seek to raise?
No, I think they've covered the issues very thoroughly. So.
Is any other party leave to appear seek to ask these witnesses any questions? No? Very well. Thank you very much for the help you've given. Very grateful to you, and you may step down and you are excused.
Thank you.
Commissioner, our first case study involves ACBF, the Australian Community Benefit Fund, and our first witness will be Tracy Walsh, a consumer. I'm in the Commissioner's hands about whether you would like us to start with Ms Walsh now or convene for an hour break and reconvene at an earlier point this afternoon.
If I take 5 minutes and we do a quarter of an hour with Ms Walsh and see how far we get. And,
Yes.
Is that all right?
Yes, it is. Thank you,
All right,
Commissioner.
I'll come back at 1:45.